So, to commemorate the Day of Reconciliation for the Indigenous people in Canada, I thought that I would bring some interesting stories. While those stories are stories about what was taking place or what took place with the natives in the Caribbean or in the Caribbean islands of places like St. Kitts, for example, St. Lucia, Dominica, they were called Caribs or Kalinago. While those stories may not exactly be what happened in North America, I thought that it would be good to look at those stories because it will kind of give us an idea of what the natives faced, the kind of duplicity and trickery, and how they were massacred with dishonesty. So last night, like I said, to kind of, um, I was in that idea of the um, 30th of September being a day of reconciliation in Canada for the Indigenous people. And then that was to kind of, for the children that were taken away from their parents and placed into residential school and all the atrocities and the things that occurred to them. So it's kind of a memo in memory of them. So on that day, people are asked to wear orange, like I'm wearing orange in this video. But like I said, this is the inspiration for this video to kind of um, pay homage and respect to what has happened to the natives of Canada or North America by giving some stories of some of the things that happened to the natives in the Caribbean islands, specifically stories about the Caribs or the Kalinago, which I kind of think that there's a lot of ancestry of Caribbean people, which is not even really looked into. The popular notion is that they were wiped out by diseases and they were all gone, but I don't think so. I think also that and their identity were changed or deliberately made to seem to be a different people. So there's a lot of popular American podcasters and people talking about like that the black people or African Americans in America are not just African descent, but there's quite a few of them that have native descent in them, but they don't really know that. So I share that point of view to an extent, but not absolutely stating that all people in the Americas or people who are black or look African are solely indigenous. But for example, but I do believe that there is more indigenous lineage in the Caribbean than is letting be known. And the idea that they try to give a particular phenotype and say this is what natives are is also it's misleading. Okay, there are possibly and most likely other phenotypes in the Caribbean, especially. I'm not gonna say for North America what it's supposed to be, but I know for a fact that most likely from Trinidad all the way up and like St. Lucia, Martinique, Grenada, St. Vincent, there are probably remnants of the Kalinago and the Carib people who um, in the population but don't realize it. And because, for example, one of the techniques used by the Europeans for colonizing the land was to say that they are African slaves. If you had any melanin or you were of a certain hue or color, then they would categorize you as either being free black or enslaved black. And that and if those who were mixed mestizos were then considered okay, well, this is the type of what mestizos look. The problem is that you're taking anybody with a darker complexion and automatically stating that they're Africans in order to make them slaves, or in order to enslave them or put them under that category of not free people, so you can take them. And it is listed that a lot of the Kalinagos were enslaved as well. And also, a lot of the Kalinagos um, were starting to mix with other populations, just like the Europeans mixed with the Kalinago. There were African slaves who mixed with the Kalinago as well. But what is important in my research, in my digging into the history of St. Lucia Creole culture, I am finding out, for example, that a lot of the practices that were very much ingrained in St. Lucian culture, Kalinago or Carib cultures, like the food. For the longest, my grandmother and the survival of people in the Caribbean was solely on something called farin, made out of manioc, made out of cassava. Um, it is reported that the governors, so one governor during colonization said that he was surprised of how well fed and thriving that the people who were living out in the mountains and the hinterland were, because not only were they making cassava, manioc, as a staple for themselves, they knew the techniques of other food crops like potatoes and maize. And we know these are specifically, and even cocoa, these are specifically Kalinago or indigenous people foods. But it might be a stretch to say because they knew it that they were Kalinago. But what is interesting is that that culture persisted throughout, and it is still present today. Even canoe making from and the trees to use, and even in our language, like Mamai Lakai, from the word Kairi, which means island. Okay, so we say in St. Lucia, Mamai Lakai to mean the people of St. Lucia, and strangely enough, it comes from the Taino word for island is Kairi. That's why you get Kilago, Cayo in Spanish. But I digress. For example, when you make farin from the manioc, it is not just a hey, this is a crop that you can eat. There's a specific way of processing it to ensure that it is not poisonous. So this is a learned skill. Also, it was the women who knew that skill, and it was my grandmother who knew that skill. So the markers are there showing you that the lineage and the attachment to the Carib culture is quite clear. For example, cocoa, pounding cocoa to make cocoa sticks, the drinks, the cocoa drinks. I've made some videos on these, so you can go back and look at it. But so back to the point of the idea of looking at some of the stories. So we're gonna start with the first story, which is, like I said, I watched, well, I may not have said it, but I looked at the Disney cartoon Pocahontas last night, just to, refresh my mind on, wow, how they depicted the natives and how they depicted the Europeans who were coming to the native lands or the indigenous people's land in the so-called New World or the Americas. We call it America because they named it after Vespucci, America Vespucci. So we say in the Americas, but I am sure that was not what the natives called their land. Like I said, Kairi and Kai. This kind of gives you an idea. And Adawa for Ottawa gives you an idea. Ottawa, Canada was the native, I think, for village is Adawa, and they thought it meant this is the place, Ottawa, but they said this is our village, Adawa. So, like, I was looking at this Pocahontas cartoon, and I was quite shocked of how they depicted John Smith as a hero and somebody who was concerned. And some of the stories I'm going to tell you shows you how duplicitous, how tricky the colonizers were, and they used everything. They used the women against their tribes. It was terrible. So let's look at the first story. And the first story looks at a gentleman or a guy named Warner, right? So Warner, he had gone to Guyana and Guyana. There's a tribe called Guarani. You should look them up as well. And if a lot of the names, like Guyana, possibly comes from their background of the Guarani. And when you think of Guarani, think of the Amazon. So the the whole bay down by the Amazon possibly was their land, and that's just one tribe. There's other Amerindians. Well, call them Amerindians from America, but there were other indigenous peoples like Kalinago and Arawak and Gorani. And that's just a few of the tribes that we know because the history has been totally distorted and wiped out that we're digging into it. And on that note, if they really want to be reconciliation, what would be good is that these archives in Spain, in Portugal, in the Vatican, the French archives, the English archives should be made available. It shouldn't be researchers that have to go and try and get that information to dig into the history so they can remember what actually happened to the Kalinago people or the Amerindians or the indigenous, not Amerindians, forgive me for that, or the indigenous people that were there when they encountered them when they came out of Europe on their western journey, so-called conquistadors, but sometimes they say they were explorers. But that then again, that shows you the ambiguity of the truth. So let's look at this guy his name was Captain Warner. Now, Captain Warner had tried along with some other people, other men, to set up a settlement in Guyana, but that was not successful. So he took a trip from Guyana. So if you're familiar with the Caribbean, Guyana is near Venezuela, and that would be in the Southern Caribbean. So he, therefore, in other words, was sailing upwards along the archipelago towards places like Florida and Cuba and Jamaica. So Guyana is to the south. They tried a settlement there. That didn't work. And so they're heading up. So he's checking the islands on his way up, which is suitable for settlement. So when you leave Guyana and you head upwards, you pass Trinidad and Tobago, probably the first island, the Grenadines, pass Martinique, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and then you get into places like Antigua and St. Kitts. So higher up so they're separated into the Windwards and the Leewards Islands. The first set of islands that you will hit if you left the coast of South America, which is Guyana near the Amazon, and headed upwards out of Trinidad and Tobago, then these would be the Windward Islands. And then as you go higher up and you get into the archipelago, into the northern islands, these are called the Leeward Islands. And St. Kitts would be one of the Leeward Islands. So he settled on deciding that St. Kitts was perfect for a settlement. But obviously, there were indigenous people occupying the land. There were indigenous people there. But you never hear in history that oh yeah, we were gonna take. There's always that they made a treaty, they made a deal, and then things went sour, and then they had to kill them all. Oh, sorry, I can't say kill. Things went sour, and then the natives had to be get rid of, or they didn't. That was it for them, right? The population was dwindled by diseases and encounters with the explorers. Okay? Encounters, right? But let's just look at the stories that I'm about to tell you so you can put things into perspective. So this Warner guy decides, well, St. Kitts. Now at that time, this is like in 1625, right? And just think of 1492, let's say 1500s. By that time, in the 1500s, the Portuguese and the Spanish especially had already come down into the Caribbean. They first encountered Hispaniola, what is now known as Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Many people go on vacation in the Dominican Republic, and everybody knows about Haiti. So that whole island was probably one of the first islands that the Spanish came on it was populated with natives, they were wiped out, or they were soon um, expelled, or they no longer existed on the island in the millions, like when they first encountered the Spanish. So by 1625, when Warner was trying to do a settlement for the British, who were Johnny come latelys into the colonization and the settlement scene, just think of the Virginia Company, which Pocahontas, the governor was member. So these are companies funded by rich merchants and rich people to go and make settlements in those lands which are so-called discovered with people on them, but make settlements in the lands of the indigenous people, right? And these are funded. This anybody with money, this is what you do, because this is a guaranteed return, because the Spanish were ripping out gold from the so-called New World. They had already destroyed civilizations like the Maya, the Aztecs, the Inca, and since the 1490 to 1500s. So by 1600, 125 years after the Spanish has been plundering and destroying civilizations and indigenous cultures for 125 years, the newcomers are coming in. Although since 1500, France has been trying to get into the so-called New World as well, but they're not as successful. The Spanish had a technique, or an approach where they were just out to plunder. Okay, like the Papal Bull said, to take the lands and possessions, and even enslave those who are non-Christians. But their goal was to basically grab the riches of the Inca, the Maya, the indigenous people, and enslave them to work mines and whatever they needed to do. The rest of Europe realized that the Spanish are literally making a mint or a killing, and so they wanted to get in on it, and they slowly started getting in. So Warner meets the leader on St. Kitts, and his name was Ubutu Tegremanti. So Tegremanti, the leader of the Carib people on St. Kitts. So the reason why I said to think of by that time, these were seafaring people. Okay, think of the indigenous people all around the North America and the Caribbean. The Caribbean indigenous people are very well known for being seafaring people. It is reported that on some of the encounters of the Spanish, they saw children literally body surfing on logs or on woods, that it looked natural for them to be in the ocean or in the water. While the big boats were coming down, they had canoes which could hold 100 people, dugout canoes in the Caribbean when the Spanish were going through there. Right? Of course, the propaganda that they're cannibals and all that, you have to take that with a grain of salt, right? Because if you want to take people's land, you have to demonize them. So here we have this idea that Warner meets with Tegramanti, and obviously, by that time, a seafaring people who would Hispaniola had been decimated, which is Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and by the Spanish, they had gone all the way to Mexico, in the peninsula, the Yucatan Peninsula, and the Aztecs, the Inca, they had been down south, lower down, and so I do believe that the traveling people had already spread the message about the the newcomers, the foreigners, which were coming in and massacring and destroying people. It makes it seem like they were looking at, like in Pocahontas, it was kind of a divination that it says, oh, these are dangerous people. Oh, no, I'm sure the record of what they were doing from the time they touched the soils and they were destroying from Hispaniola, Dominican Republic to Mexico. These were seafaring people, and the word had spread. The problem is that there were many different nations, and they spoke different languages. Even the Portuguese and the Spanish spoke different languages. And then the Portuguese and the Spanish had Italian sailors and they spoke different languages, right? And they all wanted to plant a different flag. So not only was it confusing, they were foreigners, but there were many different nations of foreigners. So just imagine what it would be for the indigenous people to see so many different groups of foreigners coming to try and take your land and enslave you. So they probably didn't, they were trying to figure out like how to play them. Like just as much as they were being conquered, they were like, do we ally with the Portuguese, the Spanish, with the French or the British, because they're fighting each other, or they each want to have settlements and colonies for themselves, and but the main focus is they're taking the indigenous property. The properties of the indigenous is being confiscated and they're being enslaved, but they're all different nations doing it. So therein lies the conundrum or the problem that the indigenous are facing. What do we do? There's so many different groups. There's a different boat. They all look alike, or some of them have dark hair, some of them have lighter hair, but they're all lighter skinned and they're all coming down and they all want the same thing: riches, land, enslavement, and on any given day, it could be a Spanish, a Portuguese, or somebody saying I'm Dutch or I'm something else, and I'm doing it on behalf of a different king. So back to the point of Warner, just like Captain Smith. This one's Captain Warner, and he's representing another company and he's making a settlement on Saint Kitts, and he meets Tegremanti, the chief of the Caribs on Saint Kitts, and that is around 1625. No, that's about 1624, right? So he's there. He apparently, it says that he makes a treaty with Tegramanti to have a settlement, a peaceful settlement, right? Probably, you never know. Promise that we're going to defend you from the others who may want to have a settlement, and we're the peaceful kind. We're not like the Spanish. We're not like the Dutch. We're not like the French. We're not like the others, right? Then by 1625, the French are coming into St. Kitts too. They apparently was unsuccessful where they were. Now, at that time, the Caribs literally, where they get the opportunity as well, they're trying to get rid of them. So they're playing the game, like welcoming you, and probably like they know that can't be trusted. The goal is to take their land. They've been enslaving them, taking their property, and they're here to stay. They're not here to trade. Like what probably was the original lie. We're here to trade with you, but no, we're here to take your land, enslave you, and take everything that you own, take your women, take your children, and you're gonna lose everything. So Tegramante originally says, okay, fine, you can have a settlement on St. Kitts. For some reason, we're not sure, but like I said, this is what's happened. So after a while, it says here that a French captain got lost, or his colonists were hoping to establish on another island. It wasn't gonna happen, so they got decimated by a Spanish armada. The Spanish are still down there trying to claim the whole of the New World, like the Pope had said. Half of the world is Spain, half of the world is Portuguese, and so they end up on St. Kitts. Warner feels sorry for them, allows them to set up a settlement. He's also thinking that they can tag team up against the natives, so he lets them set up. So he accepts the French to have a colony on St. Kitts. So by that time, they're saying that the Kalinagos or the Caribs are like, well, this is getting too much. So they're saying, like, Warner was originally skeptical that the Caribs would not accept them and think, but a thief who knows that he's gonna steal is never at ease. So he already knew the plan. But this is a massacre. It says the English and the French forces attacked the Caribs at night. After they thought that the Caribs were planning to get rid of them, which probably the Caribs from the day that they got there never wanted them anyway. And the colonists killed between 100 and 120 Caribs in their beds. That night, with only the most beautiful carried women sped to serve as slaves. The French and English set about fortifying the island against the expected invasion of the Caribs from the other islands. So they went about and killed the Caribs on St. Kitts. They got rid of their leader, Tegramanti. Okay? And there was a battle after that. To 3 to 4,000 Caribs took arms against the Europeans. And it was a bloody battle. The other islands came in and they fought against Warner and the Europeans after they had killed Tegramanti and the other people in their sleep, and only sparing the most beautiful women, man, woman, and child, gone. So this is the story of what happened on St. Kitts. Just to give you a breakdown, it says here that in St. Kitts, the English and French settlers invited the Carib Indians to a gathering where they served them alcohol and they intoxicated the whole Carib population. After they returned to their village, the colonists sneaked into the village and murdered the 120 Caribs in their sleep, including their chief, Tegramanti. The following day, nearly 4,000 Caribs, like I said, from the other islands, found out, so some of them must have escaped, and they rounded up the forces into an area known as Bloody Point. So they rounded up the 4,000 thing. They ambushed them and they massacred during the Carib resistance. 100 settlers were killed, and the remaining Caribs fled. By 1644, those not already enslaved or moved to Dominica for the slave trade. So between 1624 and 25, when they settled on St. Kitts, by 1640, they had already taken over the island. The retaliations from the other island, they were resisting them and getting rid of them and enslaving them. But a sneaky thing that happened is this, that it is said here that in that 1626 massacre on St. Kitts, after a secret meeting with the Kalinogo heads from neighboring islands of Dominica, so Tegramanti was like planning on getting rid of them, and they were supposedly betrayed by a native lady. They said she was Inegri. So in other words, they were saying she's not Carib. She's of another tribe that was supposedly enslaved by the Caribs, but living with them. But the kicker is, she supposedly was in love with Warner, just like Pocahontas was in love with John Smith and literally took the side of. So it just possibly shows you the trickery and the depths of connivery that was going on to take over these people's lands, and even lying to the women, and making them believe that they care about them in order to get secrets from them and destroy them. So he says this Negro woman named Barbie, she had recently brought to St. Kitts as a slave wife after the Kalinago had raided another tribe. According to the French historian, she despised the Kalinago and had fallen in love with Warner. So she betrayed the St. Kitts Caribs and told them that they were planning on attacking them, and that was the excuse why they intoxicated them. So if they invited them to eat and drink with them, that means they trusted those people. They ate and drank with them, got them drunk, and they went to the camp and massacred them. That's the story of one of the massacres on St. Kitts, and involving a native woman who betrayed their people. So here's another thing that I would like to point out, that in St. Lucia also, there was a man named de Rousselin, and that was in 1645. So by 26, 27, the St. Kitts massacre. In St. Lucia, there's a group of French, there's a governor who's given governorship, and he goes and he marries a native. The Rusna married a Kalinago woman, and he wanted it to prove advantageous for him to establish a settlement. Okay? He arrived, so sorry, that was in 1650. In 1650, 25 years later, you have the same techniques. A guy who wants to have a settlement in St. Lucia, he goes and he marries a Kalinago woman and shows up with 40 colonists to establish a fort in St. Lucia. Okay, it says there, after that, they had 20 years of peace because he was married to a Kalinago woman. That's another story showing you. The problem is that if you look at the history of St. Lucia, even in St. Lucia, from the first settlement of the British or the first encounter, there's a story called the Olive Blossom, which were a British ship coming out of Guyana as well that got shipwrecked on St. Lucia. And there comes the story of Robinson Crusoe, because one of the sailors were on that ship. When they got stranded on St. Lucia, and within a short space of time, the Kalinagos, they said they died out of mosquitoes and other diseases, but the Kalinagos were getting rid of them as well. So there's a theme here where the Caribs and the Kalinagos were quite aware. I mean, since 1500s, what was going on, and they probably were very weary and trying all kinds of things to accommodate, but at the same time think of ways to get rid of those settlers who were taking over their land, enslaving their people, which had happened from 1500, 1492, from the first encounter all the way up in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and now you heading down Mexico. This is happening. This is happening in St. Kitts. This is happening in St. Lucia. They're fighting all the way down the coast in Guyana. The Jesuit priests taking the church is sending people off the coast in the Yucatan Peninsula. It is a total disenfranchisement supported by governments and rich businessmen, and they're sending so-called merchants, but they're not merchants. They're settlers who are here not to have peaceful sharing settlements, but to completely take over and disenfranchise. That was always the plan. It was never to, hey, we're going to live in peaceful harmony with the people that we encounter. So that these are the two of the stories that I wanted to mention. It also says here another massacre in 1674. The Kalinago people on the west island of Dominica, this one is happening in Dominica, were brutally slaughtered by British and French troops. The area in which this happened was later called the massacre by the French because of this massacre which occurred. It's called massacre because of the massacre. The area is called massacre in Dominica. Before this massacre occurred, the Kalinago people were known to attack many European settlers. That's what it says. But yeah, that was another in 1674. The Kalinagos had raided Antigua because of what was happening, of all the colonization going on and the settlements. So they're trying to fight back, and each time they push a little back, the British or the French, with their guns and cannons, musters troops. They have merchants, rich people funding those things, and so they're coming back in, and it's an excuse to go in and massacre and wipe out the native, the indigenous people, to finally get the results that they want. They're no longer occupying the land, and it's free for settlements and occupations. After all, they're savages and uncivilized, and they're cannibals. And so this was the propaganda that was being spread in Europe at the time, and so they're just taking the land from savages, uncivilized cannibals. So I'm going to wrap this up and just say that the history of the indigenous people is very, very rich. It is amazing. Um, I have started off on a journey where I'm digging into the indigenous history that is found in the Creole culture of St. Lucia. And the things that I'm finding out by just digging into it is very eye-opening. And the way, for example, that the culture was revered nature, you could see it in the way that they used trees to make canoes, in the ways that they did weaving on baskets, pottery from clay, and so their technology was a lot more advanced than probably what is being made known of. It is sad that a lot of the history was destroyed in the attempt to settle and colonize their lands. The knowledge of plants was very deep. A lot of it is lost, possibly was labeled witchcraft by Christian settlers because it was unknown knowledge to them. And you know what happens when, if you can call people cannibals and their knowledge witchcraft, and then destroy that. And then they had this technique of possibly passing on information or teachings and skills from generation to generation. What happens when you destroy the older generation and you take away the younger generation, and the knowledge was not passed on and kept and archived? And then a lot of it is oral tradition of passing on information. So some of that is lost. At this point, what would be good is to be able to call on the um, people that have the archives of their encounters to make it available, push it out there instead of people having to come and look for the information. The Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the English, the Dutch, everybody who has information about when, what, how, the names of the indigenous people. They clearly know they married them. They clearly know they betrayed. When it's in their interest to write it down in the history books, it is there. So, and every governor used to write down what was happening in the territories that were being governed. Um, Diaries, um, notes, anything that gives the information that is in archives that is being held should now be made available. If we're dealing with the truth and reconciliation of the natives, of the indigenous people of Canada, and there's an attempt to atone for wrongs done to the indigenous people by having a day. Also, it would be good that all that information about the names, the history, the encounters, the treaties, the land, the lies, the knowledge that was recorded, which may not shared them or the people that took the indigenous land in a good light, but that knowledge should be made available. That history should be made available. But instead, you're hearing stories, for example, to juxtapose the idea of what's going on in Florida and other places. If it doesn't make certain people look in a good light, then that history should not be taught and should not be made available. But this is the exact opposite that needs to happen, especially when it comes to the indigenous people. Well, the other stories we'll get to the African people's information of their names, who was enslaved, on which plantations they were. That's something different, which also requires a release of information. But for the indigenous people, from the time of 1492 of the encounters into the New World, the recordings of what was seen, what was done, what was taken, what happened. And if they're in archives, from Spain to Portugal to the Dutch to French to the British, Scottish, wherever these information are, what was done, how should be made available so the people can remember and make themselves whole again. So this was basically a video with the inspiration on the Truth and Reconciliation going on for the Indigenous people of Canada, and having a look at some of the stories about the Indigenous people from the Caribbean. If you like the content, hit the like button and subscribe, and we will see you around for more.